Turn around and put your hands behind your back. The voice of the corporate security officer echoed across the quiet office floor as every keyboard stopped typing at once. Erin Carter, 25 years old, slowly lifted her eyes from the server dashboard glowing on her monitor and looked at the 3 security guards standing beside her desk. Co-workers stared in shock while whispers spread across the room like a sudden storm. Behind the glass wall of the executive office stood Jay Collins, her boss, arms folded with a small satisfied smile on his face. Erin stood calmly and asked in a steady voice, "Are you telling me what this is about?" One of the guards replied, "You are being escorted out for suspected theft of company funds." Erin glanced once more at Jay through the glass and quietly said, "That's a serious accusation." As the guards guided her through the office, dozens of employees watched the humiliating scene unfold while Jay stepped out of his office pretending to look disappointed. "Erin," he said loudly so everyone could hear, "I trusted you with the company's financial data systems." Erin met his eyes without a hint of panic and replied, "You trusted me because I built them." Jay shook his head and sighed dramatically. "Our audit team discovered several transfers missing from internal records, and the only person with access was you." A murmur rippled through the office as Erin's access badge was suddenly disabled at the security gate. The scanner flashed red and a guard collected the badge from her hand. Erin simply looked at Jay and said calmly, "You should have checked the logs more carefully before making this move." The police were already waiting in the lobby when Erin was escorted downstairs, their presence drawing even more attention from employees arriving for the afternoon shift. One officer stepped forward and said, "Ma'am, we need to ask you some questions regarding company financial records." Erin nodded politely and replied, "Of course, officer, but you might want to speak with the person who requested those transfers." Jay suddenly appeared behind the officers and said quickly, "She's trying to confuse the situation." Erin gave a quiet smile and said, "No, I'm simply reminding everyone that financial systems leave footprints." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Footprints?" Erin replied, "Every login, every file edit, every access point." Jay crossed his arms confidently and said, "She's bluffing because she knows the evidence is gone." Inside the interrogation room at the local precinct, Erin sat calmly while a detective placed a folder on the table and said, "Your boss claims the financial records were deleted from the internal servers." Erin leaned back slightly and folded her hands together as if listening to a lecture she had heard before. "Detective," she said gently, "do you know what my job title was at the company?" The detective glanced at the file and answered, "Senior Data Analyst." Erin nodded and replied, "Part of that job involved designing the entire server architecture and backup system for the company." The detective looked up with interest and asked, "Meaning?" Erin smiled slightly and said, "Meaning nothing inside that system actually disappears." At the same time across town, Jay Collins was celebrating in his corner office with 2 members of the executive board while a bottle of expensive wine sat open on the table. One of them asked, "Are you sure she won't cause problems?" Jay laughed confidently and said, "The files are gone and she's already the prime suspect." He lifted his glass and continued, "By tomorrow the company will believe she stole the money and tried to erase the evidence." Another executive asked carefully, "And the backup servers?" Jay waved his hand dismissively. "I made sure those logs were deleted first." Across the city in the interrogation room, Erin quietly looked at the detective and said, "Would you like to see the mirror servers that automatically record every change made to the system?" The detective leaned forward slightly as Erin calmly slid a small flash drive across the table. "Before security escorted me out of the building," she explained, "I copied the mirror server logs that record every system action in real time." The detective studied the drive and asked, "You expected something like this to happen?" Erin shook her head gently and replied, "Not exactly this, but I knew the system was vulnerable if someone with executive access tried to manipulate it." She paused before adding, "Which is why I built redundant mirror servers outside the main database." The detective exchanged a glance with another officer and said, "You're telling us the deleted files still exist?" Erin nodded calmly. "Every keystroke, every login, every deletion. Nothing actually disappears from a properly designed system." Back at the company headquarters, Jay was leaning comfortably in his chair while the executives continued their celebration. "Once the board meets tomorrow," Jay said confidently, We'll announce the theft publicly and the company will distance itself from the scandal. One of the executives frowned slightly and asked, "What if she tries to fight the accusation?" Jay smirked and replied, "She can't. The system logs are gone." At that exact moment across town, the detective plugged Aaron's flash drive into a secure computer and opened the mirrored activity logs. Rows of timestamps immediately filled the screen. Aaron pointed quietly and said, "Scroll to the deletion event from yesterday evening." The detective did, and his expression slowly changed. Aaron added softly, "Look carefully at the login credentials attached to that action." The detective leaned closer to the screen as the login data appeared clearly in the system log. "This says the deletion was performed by an executive-level account," he said slowly. Aaron nodded. "Yes, the system records the user ID, location, and device used for every command." The detective continued reading and said, "The username attached to the deletion is J. Collins." Aaron folded her hands calmly and replied, "And that's not all." She clicked another section of the logs and added, "The server also tracks where the command came from." The detective watched as a location tag appeared on the screen. "Executive Office Terminal," he read aloud. Aaron looked directly at him and said, "The same office where he accused me of committing the crime." The room became quiet as the officers studied the growing list of digital evidence appearing on the monitor. One officer asked, "Could someone have used his account without him knowing?" Aaron shook her head and opened another data panel. The system records biometric login confirmations for executive accounts. The detective looked confused. "Biometric?" Aaron nodded and explained, "Fingerprint access tied to the keyboard scanner on his desk." She pointed at the next line in the log. "You'll see the fingerprint verification right there." The detective read the entry and slowly exhaled. "So the system confirms he personally authorized the deletion." Aaron leaned back slightly and said, "Yes, and if you check the next section you'll see something even more interesting." The detective scrolled further through the mirrored logs while Aaron watched patiently across the table. Another officer leaned closer and asked, "What exactly are we looking for?" Aaron replied calmly, "The transfer commands that moved the missing money." After a few seconds the detective stopped scrolling and stared at the screen. "There it is," he said quietly. The log clearly displayed a series of transfers totaling $300,000 moved from a corporate holding account. Aaron pointed to the authorization column and said, "Notice the same executive login approving the transfers." The detective slowly turned the monitor toward his partner. The name attached to the authorization appeared again in bold system text. J. Collins. Aaron looked at them calmly and said, "Now you understand why he needed those files deleted." The detective leaned back in his chair and looked carefully at Aaron as the weight of the evidence began to settle in the room. "So your boss moves $300,000 out of the company accounts, deletes the logs and then accuses you of the crime?" he asked slowly. Aaron nodded once. "That was the plan." One officer rubbed his chin and said, "He assumed the deleted logs would erase the trail." Aaron replied, "Most companies only keep one primary server record, so deleting it can hide the activity." The detective asked, "But not in this system?" Aaron gave a small smile. "No, detective. I designed it with mirror servers in 3 locations specifically to prevent executive fraud." The detective closed the folder in front of him and said quietly, "Miss Carter, I think your boss just made a very expensive mistake." While the officers began verifying the data, Aaron continued explaining the system architecture with calm precision. Every executive login triggers a secondary verification process that records the exact workstation, biometric confirmation and timestamp, she said. One officer asked, "So even if someone deletes the files, the system still records that action?" Aaron nodded. "Yes. The mirror servers record the deletion itself." The detective stared at the screen and muttered, "So he actually documented his own crime." Aaron folded her arms lightly and said, "In a way, yes." Another officer added, "That means the money trail should still exist." Aaron pointed to another section of the log file and said, "If you scroll 2 minutes after the transfer, you'll see where the funds were routed." The detective slowly scrolled through the transaction log until another line of data appeared. "Wire transfer authorization," he read aloud. The destination account number appeared immediately below the transfer record. One officer asked, "Can we trace that account?" Aaron nodded. The system automatically records the receiving financial institution. The detective enlarged the entry and read the bank name on the screen. His eyes narrowed slightly. This account belongs to a private investment firm. Aaron leaned forward slightly and added, "Check the ownership registration." After a few seconds of searching, the officer looked up and said quietly, "The account holder is Jay Collins." The room fell silent for a moment as the detective slowly closed the laptop and said, "Well, that removes any remaining doubt." Across town, Jay Collins was still enjoying his evening celebration with the executives who believed the situation had already been resolved. One of them raised his glass and said, "To removing a problem employee." Jay smiled confidently and replied, "Tomorrow the company will move forward without distractions." Another executive asked, "Do you think she'll try to fight the accusation publicly?" Jay shook his head and said, "She won't have any evidence." Just as he finished speaking, his phone vibrated on the desk beside him. He glanced at the screen and frowned slightly when he saw the company legal department calling. "Excuse me," he said while stepping away from the table. As he answered the call, his confident expression slowly began to change. Back in the interrogation room, the detective turned to Aaron and said, "We're sending officers to your company right now." Aaron simply nodded and asked calmly, "Are they bringing a warrant?" The detective gave a small smile. "Yes, and will also request access to the executive office terminals." Aaron leaned back in her chair and said quietly, "That would be helpful." One officer asked her, "Did you know he would eventually try something like this?" Aaron thought for a moment and replied, "I knew the system could expose internal fraud if someone abused executive access." The detective stood up and closed the case file. "Miss Carter," he said firmly, "I think it's time we paid your boss a visit." The night inside the company headquarters had grown quiet as most employees had already gone home, leaving only a few lights glowing across the large open office floor. Jay had just returned to the conference room when one of the executives asked, "Everything all right?" Jay forced a small smile and replied, "Just legal checking on some paperwork." But before anyone could say another word, the glass entrance doors downstairs suddenly opened and several police officers walked into the building with firm, steady steps. The receptionist froze as the lead officer showed a warrant and said, "We need access to the executive offices immediately." Moments later, the elevator doors opened on Jay's floor. The officers stepped out calmly and one of them said loudly, "Jay Collins, we need to speak with you." The conference room fell completely silent as Jay slowly turned toward the door where the officers now stood. One executive looked confused and asked, "Is there some kind of problem?" The lead officer walked into the room and placed a folder on the table. "We are investigating unauthorized financial transfers and digital record tampering," he said clearly. Jay laughed nervously and replied, "You must have the wrong person." The officer opened the folder and slid a printed document across the table. "These server logs were recovered from a mirror system designed by your employee Aaron Carter." Jay's face stiffened slightly as the officer continued speaking. "The logs show your executive login authorizing both the financial transfers and the deletion of system records." Jay quickly stood up and said, "Those logs must be fabricated." The officer shook his head calmly and replied, "They include biometric confirmation from your workstation fingerprint scanner." One of the executives in the room slowly lowered his wine glass and stared at Jay in disbelief. The officer continued reading from the report. The system also recorded the physical location of the command terminal. He turned the page and added, "Executive Office Terminal Number 1. The room grew uncomfortably quiet as the reality of the situation began to settle over everyone present. Jay attempted another explanation. "Someone must have accessed my account without permission." The officer responded immediately, "That would be difficult considering the fingerprint verification attached to the login." The officers then placed another document on the table showing the financial transfer records. One executive leaned forward and whispered, $300,000? The lead officer nodded and said, "Transferred from the company's internal reserve account." He pointed to the receiving account information printed below the transaction. "The destination account belongs to a private investment firm." Jay quickly interrupted, "Lots of people use that firm." The officer finished his sentence calmly. "An investment firm registered under your name." The executive sitting beside Jay slowly pushed his chair back from the table and said quietly, "Jay, Please tell me that's not true. Jay's confident posture was beginning to crumble as the evidence continued stacking against him. At the police station across town, Aaron sat quietly while the detective received a phone call from the officers inside the company headquarters. After a short pause, the detective smiled slightly and hung up the phone. He looked at Aaron and said, "They found everything exactly where you said it would be." Aaron simply nodded. "The logs don't lie," she replied. The detective closed the case folder and said, "Your boss is currently being placed under arrest for financial fraud, evidence tampering, and false accusation." Aaron took a slow breath but remained calm. The detective added, "You're free to go, Miss Carter." As Aaron stood up to leave the station, she asked one quiet question. Did he look surprised? Back at the company headquarters, the officers calmly informed Jay that he was under arrest while the executives sat frozen around the conference table. "Jay Collins," the lead officer said firmly, "you are being charged with financial fraud, destruction of corporate records, and filing a false accusation against an employee." Jay tried to laugh it off at first, but the sound came out thin and forced. "This is ridiculous," he said, glancing around the room as if someone might defend him. No one spoke. One executive slowly shook his head and whispered, "You framed her." Jay attempted one last defense. "You don't understand how business works." The officer stepped forward and replied calmly, "What we understand is that you stole $300,000. The officers escorted Jay out of the building as the remaining employees watched from their desks and hallway corners in stunned silence. Word had already begun spreading through the office after security saw the police arrive. One employee whispered, "Is that the boss?" Another replied quietly, "They say he tried to frame Aaron." As Jay was led toward the elevator, he noticed several staff members staring at him with disbelief. Just hours earlier he had watched Aaron walk out of the building under accusation. Now the same hallway felt completely different. The elevator doors opened and the officer placed a firm hand on Jay's shoulder. "This way," he said. For the first time that night, Jay had no confident response. The next morning the company headquarters felt tense as executives gathered for an emergency board meeting. News of Jay's arrest had already begun circulating among employees, and rumors were spreading faster than anyone expected. One board member spoke first. "We owe Aaron Carter an apology." Another nodded and said, "More than that. She saved the company." The head of legal added, "If she had not designed those mirror servers, the fraud might never have been discovered." The room grew quiet for a moment as the chairman finally said, "Contact her immediately." One executive asked cautiously, "Do you think she'll come back after what happened yesterday?" The chairman replied honestly, "After the way she was treated, I wouldn't blame her if she didn't." Later that afternoon Aaron walked into the company lobby again, but this time the atmosphere felt completely different. The same security guard who had taken her badge the day before approached her and said quietly, "Miss Carter, the board is waiting for you upstairs." Aaron simply nodded and stepped into the elevator. When the doors opened on the executive floor, several board members were already standing near the conference room entrance. The chairman stepped forward and said, "Miss Carter, we owe you a sincere apology." Aaron listened calmly as he continued speaking. "You were falsely accused because we trusted the wrong person." Aaron replied politely, "I understand mistakes happen." The chairman then added, "But the company would like to make things right." Inside the conference room the chairman placed a document on the table in front of Aaron. "We would like you to stay with the company," he said carefully. Another board member added, "In fact, we want you to lead the entire data security division." Aaron glanced briefly at the offer letter and asked one simple question. "Why me?" The chairman smiled slightly and answered, "Because you are the only person who protected this company when no one else even knew there was a threat." Aaron leaned back in her chair thoughtfully. "Yesterday I was escorted out of this building in front of everyone," she said calmly. The room grew quiet as the board waited to hear what she would say next. The chairman folded his hands and spoke honestly. "You're right, Miss Carter. Yesterday this company failed you." Another board member nodded and added, "And if you decide to walk away we will understand." Aaron looked around the room at the executives who only a day earlier had believed she was a criminal. For a moment she said nothing, letting the silence stretch across the table. Finally she replied calmly, "The system I built was meant to protect the company, not just me." The chairman leaned forward and asked carefully, "So, Will you stay? Aaron closed the offer letter and said, I will stay under one condition. Every person in the room waited for her next words. I want full authority to redesign the company's security and compliance structure, Aaron said clearly. One board member asked, meaning? Aaron explained, meaning no executive can override security logs, no financial transfers without dual authorization, and no deletion privileges for anyone. The chairman slowly nodded. That sounds reasonable after what happened. Aaron continued, and I want the entire staff trained to recognize internal fraud risks. Another executive said, you want to rebuild the whole system. Aaron replied calmly, yes, because the biggest threats don't come from outside hackers. She paused before finishing the thought. They come from people inside the building. The board members exchanged glances before the chairman finally extended his hand. Miss Carter, the position of Director of Data Security is yours if you want it. Aaron shook his hand politely. Then I accept. One executive smiled with relief and said, the company is lucky you designed those mirror servers. Aaron stood up and replied, the company is lucky the system worked exactly the way it was supposed to. As she left the conference room, several employees quietly applauded when they saw her walking through the hallway again. The same office that had watched her humiliation now watched her return with quiet respect. Several months later, the company had completely rebuilt its security and financial monitoring systems under Aaron's leadership. The fraud investigation against Jay Collins had moved through the courts, and the evidence from the mirror servers left little room for argument. The judge sentenced him to prison for financial fraud, evidence tampering, and filing a false accusation against an employee. The stolen $300,000 was recovered and returned to the company accounts. Aaron rarely spoke about the case publicly, but inside the company everyone knew what had happened. One employee once asked her, did you know he would try to frame you? Aaron answered calmly, I only knew the system would tell the truth. One evening after finishing work, Aaron stood alone in the quiet server room checking the system monitors that tracked every action inside the company network. The mirrored servers continued recording every login, every command, and every change exactly as she designed them. A new intern watching the screens asked her, why build such a complicated system? Aaron smiled slightly and replied, because the truth should always leave a trail. She shut down the monitor and turned toward the door. As she walked out of the room, the intern thought about everything he had heard about the case that changed the company forever. And it left him wondering one simple question. If you were in Aaron's position, would you have warned your boss before the system exposed him?